The atmosphere at Los Angeles International Airport was charged with an almost palpable energy, as if everyone there shared a collective premonition. The constant flow of passengers, voices mingling in dozens of languages, and the characteristic sound of rolling luggage echoed through the terminal, creating a typical yet tense scene. Among the hundreds of travelers anxiously awaiting boarding for Flight 317 bound for Tokyo, there was an almost tangible sense of anticipation. Every glance seemed to carry a story. Every movement was a piece in a puzzle that no one knew where it would end. Something about that day felt different, as if the very air was laden with possibilities or omens. Among the first-class passengers, one man quickly stood out: Oliver Bennett. It wasn't due to admirable behavior or natural charisma, but because of his presence that exuded an inflated, almost suffocating ego. Oliver didn't need introductions. He made sure everyone knew who he was. Founder of a startup that dominated social media headlines, he cultivated a carefully planned image of a technological genius, someone who was not just part of the digital revolution, but considered itself the heart of it. Every move he made seemed rehearsed to reaffirm this narrative. Upon boarding, he was greeted by the flight attendant with a professional smile, but any closer look would reveal it to be forced. Of course, Oliver wasn't that observant. He returned the greeting with a casually disdainful expression while adjusting his designer blazer folded over his arm. Taking his privileged seat, A1, the ultimate symbol of his self-proclaimed success, Oliver arranged his belongings with the precision of someone who knew that space was made for him. His state-of-the-art headphones had barely rested on his ears when he noticed with evident relief that the seat next to him, A2B, was still empty. "Excellent," he murmured to himself, clearly pleased to maintain his bubble of isolation. For him, flying first class wasn't just a matter of comfort, but a silent affirmation of his superiority. But this moment of tranquility was interrupted when a passenger occupied the seat beside him. Unlike Oliver, he seemed perfectly comfortable in his simplicity. An ordinary sweatshirt, worn jeans, and a baseball cap pulled forward, almost obscuring his face. There was something so unpretentious about the man that he could easily be ignored, which Oliver did without hesitation. He merely cast a quick glance before turning to his laptop, diving back into what he believed was a schedule full of important tasks. However, the man didn't seem bothered by the lack of attention. He sat naturally and wished good night in a friendly tone. Oliver responded with a monosyllabic murmur, something low enough to avoid any possibility of conversation. To him, silence was a sign of productivity. However, as the plane's engines roared and the aircraft reached cruising altitude, Oliver began to feel a growing irritation. It wasn't noise, it wasn't movement, it was the man next to him. There was something intriguing about him, but Oliver couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. Maybe it was his overly calm behavior, or that slight smile that appeared while he looked at his cell phone. The flight attendant brought the first drinks. True to his style, Oliver chose champagne while the man ordered something unexpected: water. The simple choice seemed like an insult to the implicit rules of first class. "Seriously? Water?" Oliver murmured to himself, but couldn't resist a more audible comment. "Looks like you should be in economy class," he said with a sarcastic laugh, casting a quick glance at the man beside him. The passenger just smiled slightly, undisturbed. That lack of reaction only amplified Oliver's irritation, making him feel the need to reaffirm his status. As always, he found the perfect opportunity to dominate the conversation. "So," he began, with the casual tone of someone who already knew where he wanted to go, "what do you do for a living?" "I work with technology," the man replied briefly and calmly, almost as if he didn't want to prolong the conversation. This simplicity struck Oliver as a challenge. He leaned in slightly, determined to regain control. "Ah, technology? So we're in the same world," he continued, with a smile he clearly considered charming. "I'm the CEO of a startup that's transforming the industry. It's fascinating how this sector attracts so many overrated figures, like Elon Musk." It was the beginning of a monologue disguised as dialogue. Oliver unraveled a list of criticisms: SpaceX, Tesla, Twitter, all easy targets for his sarcastic analysis. As he spoke, his hands gesticulated vigorously, as if he wanted to sculpt his opinions in the air. The man next to him, however, remained unshaken, limiting himself to vague responses like, "Interesting," or "He did some good things." Each neutral reply seemed to further destabilize Oliver, who raised his tone and intensity, trying to elicit some validation. The most impactful moment, and undoubtedly the most humiliating, arrived without warning, like a lightning bolt through a clear sky. In the midst of another of Oliver's provocations, the flight attendant approached seat A2B with a visibly respectful posture. Her voice carried an unusual formality, as if she were in the presence of someone whose importance surpassed the usual dynamics of first class. "Mr. Musk," she said with a slight smile, "the captain asked to confirm your connection to Tokyo." The words hit Oliver like an invisible punch to his ego, causing him to freeze instantly. Each syllable seemed to reverberate in his mind, as the realization hit him with an overwhelming weight. The ordinary-looking man beside him, whom he had incessantly criticized, was none other than Elon Musk. The shock was so great that his throat went dry and his mind, usually quick to formulate arrogant responses, went completely blank. He stood there, staring blankly into nothingness, as the full meaning of the situation washed over him like an overwhelming wave. Elon Musk, for his part, simply thanked the flight attendant with a courteous nod, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred, before calmly returning to his book. The interaction was brief, but transformative, at least for Oliver. Suddenly, every criticism, every sarcastic joke, and every word laden with disdain he had uttered before took on an unbearable weight. They weren't just empty comments. They were arrows shot at one of the most influential figures in the world, and worst of all, someone who had been just inches away from him the entire time. Oliver's embarrassment seemed to overflow from the very air of the cabin. The ensuing silence was not just uncomfortable, it was almost deafening. Even the other first-class passengers, who had noticed the interaction, maintained absolute discretion. No direct looks, no whispered comments, but there was a tension in the environment that was impossible to ignore. Oliver felt as if everyone there knew exactly what was happening, even if no one dared to say it. Paralyzed, Oliver tried to organize the whirlwind of thoughts crashing over him. After all, what can one do when they realize they've just insulted not only one of today's greatest visionaries, but someone who shared the same intimate space for hours? He averted his gaze to the laptop, but any attempt to resume work was futile. His hands, usually steady and confident, now trembled slightly. After a few interminable minutes, he finally mustered the courage to speak. His voice, once full of certainty, was now hesitant, almost trembling. Turning slightly to Elon, he managed to say, "So you're Elon Musk." The phrase came out as an obvious statement, but it was clear he needed to hear the direct confirmation. Elon looked up from his book for just a moment and replied simply, "That's what they say." There was something in Elon's tone, light without arrogance, that made Oliver even more uncomfortable. In a clumsy attempt to ease the tension, he tried to justify himself. "I didn't mean anything by what I said earlier, you know. I was just venting." Elon remained calm, observing Oliver with an analytical gaze that seemed to see beyond the words. There was no hostility, but there was also no rush to offer any comfort. When he finally responded, it was with an almost disconcerting serenity. "I don't take it personally. For many, that would have ended the interaction. But for Oliver, the need to prove something, or perhaps to repair what already seemed irreparable, led him to continue. You must get used to it, right? I mean, with criticism." Elon paused for a moment, as if carefully choosing his words. "Criticism is useful, as long as it's constructive," he said, before adjusting his position in the seat. "Were yours constructive?" This question hung in the air like a sharp blade, forcing Oliver to avert his gaze, embarrassed. He knew very well that his previous words had been nothing more than empty expressions of disdain. But to Oliver's surprise, Elon continued, turning the moment into something unexpected. With a polite and calm tone, he began to address the points Oliver had mentioned, not to defend himself, but almost like a lesson. "You mentioned Tesla. Did you know that the driver assistance technology we've developed has already saved thousands of lives? How many accidents have been prevented because our systems gave drivers a fraction of a second more to react?" Oliver tried to murmur something, but was interrupted by Elon, who continued, "Regarding SpaceX and the rockets that explode, you're right. They do explode. But you know what happens after each explosion? We learn. Every test brings us closer to something greater, reducing the costs of access to space to levels that were previously unimaginable. This means more global communication, scientific advancements, and perhaps one day solutions to protect humanity from a possible extinction. Elon's words carried weight, not due to arrogance, but because they were backed by undeniable facts. With each sentence, Oliver felt himself sinking deeper into his chair. He had always considered himself an expert, someone who understood the directions of technology. But in the presence of Elon Musk, his opinions seemed insignificant. It was as if he was being confronted with the true magnitude of the world he so pretended to dominate, forced to see that his vision was limited and superficial. But Elon wasn't finished. He adjusted his position in the seat, and with the same serenity he had shown so far, began to address the most controversial topic of all: Twitter. His voice lowered a bit, as if he were reflecting out loud. "Yes, Twitter is chaotic," he began, with an almost introspective tone. "But progress often comes with chaos. It's the friction that generates new ideas, and without it, nothing evolves." The sentence, simple in form, was deeply laden with meaning. It hung in the air like a philosophical teaching that seemed to speak not only to Oliver, but to everyone who had ears to listen. The silence that followed was almost deafening. In first class, every small noise, the click of a seatbelt or the sound of a glass placed on the table, seemed amplified, as if the environment was waiting for the depth of the words to be absorbed. Although Elon was directing his observations at Oliver, other passengers were clearly attentive. Some tried to appear indifferent, but it was impossible to ignore the presence of someone like Elon Musk, speaking with such clarity and intention. No matter how discreet he tried to be, he was undeniably a magnet for attention, even when he seemed just another passenger. For Oliver, Elon's words began to slowly penetrate the barriers of pride and self-sufficiency he carried. He sighed heavily, looking away as he murmured, "I never thought about it that way. I admit I was too quick to judge." It was a hesitant confession, but laden with genuine contrition. For the first time in a long while, Oliver seemed to realize the limitations of his own worldview. Elon remained calm, observing Oliver with that calculated look that seemed to not only listen to the words, but also interpret the intention behind them. After a few moments, he responded with a tone that mixed firmness with a hint of empathy. "Truth doesn't change based on who's listening. Maybe that will help you think better next time." The words weren't offensive, but they struck Oliver like a precise blow. There was no arrogance or condescension. It was a pure and direct lesson. For Oliver, it was exactly what he needed to hear. He lifted his head and for a brief moment met Elon's gaze. It was like a silent exchange of recognition, the kind of moment where someone realizes they've lost but gained something much more valuable: a new perspective. The rest of the flight was a complete transformation of what it had been until then. Oliver, who had begun the journey as a loud and ostentatious figure, was now silent, immersed in his own thoughts. He looked out the window as if mentally reviewing his life, his choices, and most importantly, his behavior. For the first time, it seemed his confidence had been replaced by introspection, something he rarely allowed himself. Elon, on the other hand, remained as he had been from the start, calm, focused, completely at ease. He returned to his book, ignoring any furtive glances or curiosity that might have been directed at him. To him, perhaps that moment was nothing more than a common interaction, one of the countless he had already experienced. When the plane finally landed in Tokyo, Oliver hesitated before standing up. He seemed to be fighting an internal battle, trying to decide whether or not to speak to Elon again. Each step felt heavy as he placed his carry-on in the aisle, but deep down, he knew he needed to do it. He took a deep breath, turned to Elon, and said with visible sincerity, "Mr. Musk, I just wanted to apologize for everything. I guess it's easy to criticize from the outside, but I can't imagine the weight of what you do." Elon looked up from the book, analyzing Oliver for a moment. His expression was not one of judgment, but of genuine consideration. After a brief silence, he responded with a slight smile, "Apology accepted. Progress will always face resistance, But the secret is not to give up. These words remained in Oliver's mind as he watched Elon disappear into the airport, accompanied by his team. It was a memorable moment, a lesson he would never forget. For the first time in years, Oliver felt something rare: humility. It was no longer about impressing others with his appearance or achievements. He had a new goal: to do something that truly mattered, something that could leave a lasting impact, just as Elon Musk did every day.